Mr. Anthony Mann to the stage, and he will speak about his Senior Policy Advisor and VAT and Adult Learning Centre for Skills in OECD. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I think you need to have the earphones potentially, if you haven't got those already, for the translation. I just wanted to say, what a brilliant way to start a conference like this, with the contribution from our student who asks such a good question. You know, what do people actually do all day? What do people actually do in these jobs? How does it work? That's a brilliant question. It's a key question. And in the reflection earlier on about the ways that we end up in places, the way that lives unfold, the ways in which chance sometimes plays such an important role. And I think about why I'm here, and I think I'm here partly because about 10 years ago I sat next to somebody at a wedding, and we were bored, and we talked, and I got information which I wouldn't have had from anywhere else, and that helped me enormously. And I think in what you do, what we're trying to do is take some of those really fortuitous, some of those lucky chance encounters, and make them something which is systematic, make them something which we can ensure all young people have the opportunity to find out what people actually do, how do you get these jobs, how does it work? We think a lot about robots at the OECD, and I'll tell you a little bit about the OECD in a moment. But what our aspiration is we think we'll never be able to compete with the robots. We shouldn't try and be second-rate robots. We should try and be first-class humans. And by embracing the things which makes us distinctive, our creativity, our ability to think laterally, our ability to problem solve, our ability to work together, to resolve problems together. So I work for OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an international organisation. We have 36 member countries, including Estonia. Our job really is to help countries to try and improve public policy through comparative evidence by looking at how different countries do the same things and allow them to learn from each other's. My area of specialism is around career guidance. Previously, I worked on vocational education and training, and that's when I was last in Estonia, maybe 2 years ago, working on a review of vocational education and training then. And so for me, there is no better audience than you, because you know what I'm talking about, and you can tell me if you think it sounds true to you, or if it doesn't. I really want to know your feedback, hear what you've got to say, because I'm going to present to you some of the the big international data about what young people think about their careers, and how that thinking is shaped by the society around them, and what implications that has. So just before I start, when we were here 2 years ago, when we were looking at vocational education, we did look at career guidance because we thought there was a particular issue around career guidance, because so many young people in Estonia have to make very important decisions in grade 9. And we felt strongly that it was really important to have sort of mandatory sessions with career counsellors before year 9. We thought it was important that young people got to see vocational schools, meet people who do jobs to which vocational programs are gateways. We thought it was important to look at how other countries use destination surveys. What happens to people after they complete certain programs. But particularly in vocational education, it's not so much about the course itself, about what that course leads to. That's the really important thing, which is the real driver for the young person. And we also thought that there was an opportunity for greater engagement with people in work to find out, what these people actually do all day. And we thought, there's an opportunity to do more earlier. So I'm going to talk to you for about 30 minutes or so about these things. I think we feel at the OECD that career guidance has never been so important. And I think lots of other international organisations and academics and scholars believe this. And I want to share with you some of the arguments which we think are very important there. In particular, as well, I want to talk about this question about employer engagement in education. And that's something where I think a lot of career guidance hasn't taken as full advantage of the opportunities presented to engage young people with people in work as is possible. That's something I spend a lot of time thinking about. And so let's hear the case for career guidance in 2020. And I should say, I'm going to talk about young people. The OECD is doing some new work on adults, It's probably something that might get published towards the end of this year and into next year. So look out for that. But I'm going to talk particularly about young people this morning. We have a few publications which may be of interest to you. Probably the one which is most recent and most relevant is Working It Out from last year. But what I'm going to talk to you mostly is about PISA and some of the insights we have from the PISA test. And I imagine that if you're in Estonia, you know all about PISA. Yeah. Estonia did very well on PISA. Best results in Europe. I imagine that's something to be very proud of, and rightly so. I mean, it's difficult. For PISA 2018 in Estonia, about 230 schools, about 5,000 young people, nearly half of all the cohort. These are 15-year-olds. And we've been doing PISA for nearly 20 years now, and so we have a database which is growing, and we have questions in the main questionnaire about career expectations, educational expectations, in the questionnaire about schools, about how career guidance is delivered, and these are questions which are very useful to us. We also have a second questionnaire called the Educational Career Questionnaire, which Estonia did not participate in, and may like to reflect upon that decision for next time round, because this asks some really useful questions about what have you actually done? Have you participated in career development activities? Like, have you spoken to a career counsellor within school or outside of school? Have you been to a jobs fair? Have you done an internship in work? Have you visited an institution which offers upper secondary education? Have you visited a university? And so these are very useful questions, but also questions about participation in some of the activities which helped you prepare for your transitions into work. And so the results are beginning to get published. These are two publications which came out, which have got some data in. We're going to publish more in the next 2 weeks, and we'll publish more still in April. So, can look out for those. There's more and more of this data coming to the public domain. And I should say that, the OECD has not published lots on this in the past. So this for us is a declaration of we're saying, and our countries are telling us, career guidance is really important. It's more important than it has been in the past. So what is our case for career guidance? Well, in a nutshell, in essence, what we would say that never before in human history has career guidance been so important. And our starting point for arguing that is we look simply at young people stay in education longer and longer. This generation of young people, the ones which are in schools now, in the whole of human history, we've never had a generation of young people, on average, more years of education to the name, more highly qualified. Estonia has a strong tradition of higher education, but this graph here is looking at the proportion of the population with tertiary education. And we see here, this is young people, so young people here, this is old people. And we kind of see that everywhere, a great percentage of young people have higher education. And so when you do that, as you all know, you need to make more decisions. You need to make more decisions about what you study, where you study, how hard you study. And it's the same as if you're looking at vocational routes as well as academic routes. If you're staying in education for longer, you need to make more decisions. But those decisions themselves are getting harder because the labour market is changing much more quickly than it has in the past. And if we look here, this is the kind of the OECD average for jobs which are at risk of automation. And how we do this is that we have another survey called PIAC, which people may have heard of, and that questions adults about the work which they do. And we break down their jobs into tasks, and then we talk to experts about, can that task be automated? And by doing that, we are able to, in probably the most sophisticated way that anybody's been able to do this, work out whether jobs are at high risk of automation or complete risk of, or moderate risk, significant risk of automation. It doesn't mean it will necessarily happen, but it means the risk is very high. And we all know that because we see ourselves as we go through our daily lives, the way that technology is changing work. And some jobs are disappearing, but other jobs are radically changing. And so for young people, as we heard this morning, one of the questions is it worth me trying to pursue this job, or will the robots be doing it? So automation is changing things. We also have, we have new forms of work. The platform economy is very big in Estonia. So is it self-employment? Is it being an entrepreneur? Is it trying to set up your own startup? How do you plan to do that? How do you harness the biggest opportunity you have through your life to develop your human capital, to position yourself in somewhere which aligns with your interests, your passions, your possibilities? How do you connect the two things when the thing at the other end, what's going to happen to you in employment, it seems to be changing so quickly? And we also know here, the question about inequality, we see inequality raising everywhere, and that's a real issue for the stability of societies. But for young people, there's a particular challenge here, because we know from the way that technology is changing, these jobs, which are at risk of automation, particularly they affect younger people, because those entry-level jobs are often lower skill, easier to automate, fewer decisions that a human has to make. And so for young people, we have a risk as well that you might leave education and get trapped. And we kind of know that in Estonia, we have some indications that there is, that school-to-work transitions aren't particularly smooth. We know that about 20% of the young people who start going to vocational education in Estonia have previously been at university. So, they kind of say to stay to university and then they go into vocational education, which, may be completely fine, but it suggests that something's not working smoothly. We know from PIAC that about 1/3 of the working population in Estonia is a poor match in terms of the job they do when you look at the qualifications they have by level or by subject. And we know in general across the OECD that if you don't have the qualification which matches what's normal for the job you do, there's a wage penalty. You earn 11% less than somebody who does have the qualification. And so we kind of have some indications that things aren't working well, and we have a strong fear that things are going to get worse or more difficult in order to make these transitions. We also know, and this is kind of part of this debate about why career guidance is more important. We also know that there is stronger and stronger evidence that what young people think about their careers and what they do in relation to the world of work while they're young does have a real difference to what becomes to them in adults. So if you look at longitudinal studies, the longitudinal studies takes a group of people, maybe from birth, maybe 10,000 people from birth or as children, and it follows those people through their lives. So it's one cohort. You keep coming back to them every maybe 5 years, every 10 years, and you ask them lots and lots of questions about themselves, their backgrounds, their families, their education, and then you can draw statistical relationships between the things you do in childhood and what becomes. There's a really interesting thing. At 5, if you're very good at drawing a human figure, you earn more later on in life. And you can control for the things which normally distort or influence who earns what, about your social background, how many qualifications you've got, and so on. And what we find is that a relationship or connection with the labour market makes a difference. So that young people who work part-time at the same time as doing their full-time studies as teenagers, they go on to earn more in adulthood. And I can point to longitudinal studies in the US and Australia and the UK, which have looked for these relationships. We also know that what young people think about their futures makes a difference. That to a meaningful extent, the aspirations that young people have as teenagers have a predictive quality. If you say that you're going to be a professional, you are more likely to end up a professional than we would expect given your background and your qualifications. So they mean something. And we kind of know, kind of teenage uncertainty, career uncertainty. And in Estonia, uncertainty is growing. It's now about 25% of the population. We asked this in PISA. With uncertainty, we know that generally it's like it's connected with worse outcomes after people have left school. Harder to find employment, more likely to be NEET, lower earnings than you would expect. It's not always the case. Sometimes, some people, who are highly educated might say, I'm going to study, history at the best university in Tallinn, and then I'll keep my options open. And if they're from a very supported background, we see less of an impact. But more often, it's young people from poorer, more disadvantaged backgrounds who say, I don't know what I want to do, I don't know what I want to be, and we find that they do worse than we would expect them to. So we know that these relationships are taking place. And we kind of look here. This is an insight here into the PISA results for 2018 about what young people in Estonia actually aspire to. And what we find is that this is actually pretty typical for OECD countries or countries taking part in PISA. Particularly, I suppose it's pretty typical for the OECD. PISA was a much broader range of countries. And so what I'll point out here is, for example, in 2006, 2018, what we find is that about half of girls are interested in just 10 jobs. If we look at boys, so the boys here, 2006, we see a reduction, 58% to 53%, interested in just 10 jobs. And the question here is important because the question is, what job do you expect to have when you're 30? It's not what job would you like to have, what job would you love to have, what job do you cross your fingers and hope to have. I still want to be a footballer, still do, not too late. About what job you want to have, it's what you expect to have. So this is their expectation, and perhaps it's no surprise that nearly 1 in 5 boys in Estonia, this percentage of people expressing a preference, want to work in ICT. That's perhaps not a surprise. Some of the things are a bit surprising here when you look compared to other countries. For girls, actors and musical performers are higher here than they are in many other countries. But we kind of see that, a lot of these jobs are sort of quite traditional. A lot of these jobs are certainly 20th century jobs, maybe even 19th century jobs, many of them. We see that there is, aspirations tend to be, high. And having high aspirations is good. If you have high aspirations as a young person, it tends to have a positive effect on your academic studies. You do better academically than you might expect. But, we can think about what proportion of the actual population do these jobs. Is there, 11% of the girls want to be doctors? That in no way relates to the actual demand in the labour market for doctors. And across the OECD, we see a pattern of these jobs becoming, these expressions of interest, these anticipated expectations of jobs, becoming more concentrated. And it tends to be that it's not in Estonia, but elsewhere, it's boys, it's poorer students, it's lower performers who are becoming more concentrated in being interested in just a smaller number of jobs. And I think this is an indicator for us, and I think what we would hope is to see over time these sorts of numbers reducing, broader aspirations. High aspirations are good, but we want broader aspirations, and I think that's something maybe we don't always focus on enough. We know that this again, I'm still thinking about what's the case for career guidance. Why is what you do really important? Well, we've got this evidence that that young people have very concentrated career aspirations. We know as well that they're very distorted by their social background. We know simply that if you look at 2 young people with the same levels of academic ability, and in our PISA tests, we give them tests for literacy, for numeracy, and for science, and so we can tell from those who is well placed to progress to university and do well at university and who isn't. We kind of know that if you're from an advantaged social background, you're much more likely to want to go to, stay in education than you are somebody from a disadvantaged background. And I'll show you some of the 2018 results for PISA for Estonia in a moment. We know too that gender is a really big influence, and I'll show you. You saw in that earlier slide how gender influences or is related to the career aspirations of young people. But we know this is kind of like a positive thing and a negative thing. We see that if we think about gender equality from the perspective of girls, we know that girls are far more ambitious in terms of wanting to stay in education for longer. But we also know that often they attract or they express interest in careers which pay less. And that's something we saw in vocational education when we were here 2 years ago. And there's a real need to try and address the channeling of boys and girls into different professions through the choices they make. Here's the picture for Estonia. In Estonia, we kind of see some of the change between 2006 and 2018. But this sort of pattern, up here you have the girls. I'm a bit colourblind, and I just found out this morning this is probably pink. Is that right? All right. I didn't mean it for it to be pink. Actually, the analyst who helped me sort of pull these together, Vanessa. I think maybe this is just what we do, but I didn't realise this was pink. So this is pink. Sorry, and this is blue. I also didn't realize that. My color blindness is really bad. Anyway, so you'll kind of see that this sort of pattern is really uneven. These are, I think, the top 15 jobs. And you kind of see that if you look at just the jobs that boys and girls are interested in, our level of concentration is lower because, boys and girls are so interested in different jobs, totally different jobs. And so we have an issue here about sort of very gendered career aspirations. We know as well from Estonia. So here's in Estonia. This is the thing I was talking about, the extent to which advantage and disadvantage. And this is a kind of a range of different sort of like indicators, but mainly it's about social class, so where somebody's from. We know here that so like typically about 20% of students with the with the ability don't express any interest in completing tertiary education, going to university. But the pattern is, it's the disadvantaged students who are much more likely to maybe they're not aware they have the ability, don't have the confidence to do this. They, maybe it's a social issue, or maybe it's just that people like us don't do that, which is one of these unspoken assumptions or expectations, which is really, I think, at the heart of career guidance to address. Because people don't know what they don't know, and sometimes they express what they don't know. But when we look at these patterns, it's really clear. And it's not just Estonia. Across the whole of the OECD, kids from disadvantaged backgrounds who have the ability are saying this is something they're not planning to do. This is a similar chart, but when we ask them what job do you expect to do age 30, we classify those jobs in a particular category to say, do you expect to be a professional or a manager? And it's the sort of job you might enter through university. And again, it's, we have this indication of these are young people who are higher performers. And so in the PISA test, we have the 3 tests, and on one, they've got, middle ranking at least 2 and high ranking at least 1. And we find a similar pattern. Boys particularly, so less ambitious than girls. Disadvantaged students are most, the most unlikely most likely to express. And that relates here to a problem called misalignment. I don't know if you've come across this. This is something which is drawn out of these longitudinal studies, which I was telling you about a moment ago. So remember, in those longitudinal studies, you follow a cohort of young people from birth all the way through to kind of adulthood. And many times at 16 or 15, they ask them questions like, what job do you expect to get? What job do you expect to get? Often these are a very similar question. Sometimes it's what you aspire to, but often it's what job do you expect to get as an adult? And then they ask them as well, how much education do you expect to get? Will you leave school as soon as you can? Will you leave, will you stay to have up secondary qualification? Will you go to vocational school? Will you go to university? Do you expect to get postgraduate thing? And if somebody underestimates at 16, the level of education they need to meet their occupational expectation, a simple example would be is that I want to be a lawyer, but I'm going to leave school straight away and with no qualifications. My chance of becoming a lawyer is very difficult. Things vary in countries, but you understand the concept. And it's an illustration for us, we think, of confusion, that some young people haven't really thought about it, or if they have thought about it, they don't really have the information to hand to understand what you need to do in order to be able to become the person you want to be. And so misalignment at 16, through various longitudinal studies, is related to worse outcomes as a young adult. People are more likely to be neat or unemployed, lower earnings. And it kind of suggests that if young people are going through the education system, building up their human capital through this big opportunity which they have, and then when they get to the other end, they get caught out. And then they're not meeting their potential. They find it harder than we expect them to do. And again, it's our disadvantaged students who are much more likely to be misaligned. Nearly 4 times more likely to be misaligned than our more advantaged students. And by advantage and disadvantage, what we do is we take the sample, we use a number of indicators, but this is the 25% we think are most advantaged, and this is the 25% we think are least advantaged. And so we look at those two sort of like quartiles. I spent a lot of time saying we think there is a problem, and you're all involved in trying to solve that problem, I think. you're all involved in trying to make sure that young people make confident, informed decisions about their futures, are able to connect their educational choices to future occupational goals and ambitions. And there's better evidence than ever before that career guidance really does work. Now, this is a study which I was involved in before I joined the OECD, but it uses literature from across the OECD. And this was, I think, the UK government commissioned, so it looks at studies in lots of different countries. And these studies have all got particular characteristics. They're either longitudinal data studies, where you follow these group of people from birth all the way through, and that allows you to have particular confidence, or they're randomized controlled trials, where you take maybe a few hundred children and then randomly say, one, you're going to do this intervention, you're not going to do the intervention. We think there's nothing really which is that different between the two of you. It's chance which decides who gets to do it. And then we follow you over time to see whether it does make a difference. It's an experiment. So these are experimental or quasi-experimental studies. And we looked at their conclusions. They're all about all sorts of different things. Some are about counsellors, some are about things like job shadowing programs or mentoring, the whole range of different activities which you'll be involved in. And we came to a view about, in general, is it largely positive? Is it largely negative? Or is it it's hard to sell, really? Maybe some people benefit, other people don't. And this is what we found. What we found is that, overwhelmingly, the results are largely positive in terms of what happens to young people. If you look at good studies which you can rely on, we found here that often outcomes are mixed, which suggests it may be something to do with the quality of how it's delivered, is it to the right people at the right time, or perhaps that some people benefit, other people don't. And if we think maybe about the way that disadvantaged young people might benefit more because they've got more information gaps than advantage, maybe you might see something there. But this is the important thing. It's pretty much never a complete waste of time. So what we know is that these are investments which are of value to young people. And so when I say to you, career guidance is more important than ever before, that's because the challenge is greater than ever before, but also the evidence about what you do making a difference is stronger than ever. From the literature which we've been exposed to, what we would say is that there are various sort of principles which we think are particularly important in terms of what makes for effective career guidance. And I'll run through these quite quickly. I'm sure many are familiar to you. Maybe there are other things which you think we missed out, which we should focus on more. But it tends to be perhaps here things which perhaps are less typical of very narrow career guidance services. So we believe strongly that it should start early, because career guidance we need to not think about it in terms of access to information. And maybe you had that sort of experience where career guidance was a library or a shelf, or where you pick, you had to look up, what forestry workers do, and then trying to decide what you wanted to do. And career guidance is about addressing expectations and assumptions as much as providing information. And expectations and assumptions start young. They start when people are in primary school, and we see it particularly in the way that gender influences people's assumptions about, what's it's natural or unnatural for people to do. Whether boys can work in childcare, whether girls become engineers, whether people like us do apprenticeships or people like us go to university. Those are assumptions which start very young. We see as well that career guidance serves this really beneficial purpose, particularly in primary, but through education, in allowing young people to connect the learning which they're doing at school and their future economic lives. And we're identifying evidence which shows this is very motivational for young people. And I think that's an important part of the service. In some systems, the career guidance is something which you do in a corner, roped off from the rest of the school. I think there's a strong case for it to be more integrated into the life of the school and its subject teaching. The labour market information needs to be trustworthy, needs to be up to date, particularly in the world which is changing. Well-trained, impartial advisors, which we know is important. Thinking about and understanding where, we call them information asymmetries, which is to say, where we know that the labour market is not signalling well to young people, where there are good jobs, but young people aren't interested in them, don't know about them, and don't know their roots into them. Where things are emerging, and we know that in 10 years' time, green technology is going to be huge, but it's not doing it now. or because there's lots and lots of small businesses, and small businesses don't signal well, and parents don't know what they do because it's younger people who are doing it already. So, we need to have a strong sense about how well the labour market is signalling and address that. Broadening as well as raising expectations. Targeting particularly young people from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, and rich and plentiful engagement from the world of work. And that's something which I just want to spend, the last, few slides sort of talking about. This is something which I've been working on very heavily for the last few years. Other people as well. And it's, we've done a similar sort of like analysis of the good studies on employer engagement and education. And by employer engagement and education, what I mean is not vocational education, but it's within either vocational or general education, where young people are directly exposed to people from the world of work. So it's job fairs where you bring employers in. It's career talks where you bring somebody from workplaces in to talk to young people. It's job shadowing. It's mentoring programs. It's work placements. It's these things where they get first-hand experience, and it's not a career guidance professional giving the advice to the young person, but it's the career guidance professional acting as the gateway to enable them to interact directly with people from the world of work. And what we find here is that, again, very rarely, complete waste of time. That's good. You're totally better off doing something else altogether. Hardly ever happens. But maybe slightly more mixed sort of like outcomes. But the economic ones are, I think, the ones which we think are most important, because they're the ones which get the employers involved. Because from the employer's point of view, the motivation here is to have a better flow of people with talent and interest into the jobs which they have to offer. Now, I would highlight a few studies. I'm not going to go into detail about these. I think these slides are going to be made available. So if you want to read journal articles, I can point you in the right direction of interesting things. This is a really interesting one. I just very quickly, this study here looked at longitudinal data following young people who at 16 take part in career talks with people from outside of school. Right. And so at 16 they do this, and they do it between the ages of 14 and 16. And they ask them at 16, how many did you do? Were they any good? And it turns out that if you say, yes, I did some, particularly if you did 5 or more, you earn more at age 26. And you can control for social background, the qualifications you've got, all those sorts of things which normally make the difference. But the really interesting thing is that if the young person themselves said they were very helpful at 16, well, it turns out they were right. And they get a much bigger premium at age 26. And what this does, it kind of fits with, kind of like a theory of change. And this is the kind of the sociology for you. This is the theory of change. In that, so young people have a very narrow sense about, the world of work. What do people actually do all day? It's very mysterious. It's very narrow. They know what it's really hard sometimes to know what your mum and dad do all day. I'm sure my kids have got no idea about what I do. But it's very, it's really hard, this stuff. So you've got a very narrow perspective. You watch TV, you see your teacher. You sometimes see doctors and nurses. They interact with you. So your starting point is very narrow. And then there's lots and lots of information. But sometimes there's too much information, and you don't know what to trust. And sometimes you don't trust your parents because your parents just want you to do, be a doctor. I don't know, do what I do. And you don't always trust, your teachers because you don't think they necessarily know what it's anything about except for teaching. And maybe they won't even trust career guidance professionals because they don't understand what you do, and you might not see them very often, so you don't really build up a relationship. But the thing about direct exposure to the world of work, what makes it so important, is that for young people, the information they get from that they see as very authentic. If somebody's not trying to sell them something, why would somebody not tell them straight? They can go into workplaces and see for themselves and ask those questions like, what's it like to be a woman in this workplace if you have a child? What's it actually like? You need to hear another woman tell you the answer to that question. You're much more likely to really believe in that. And so the authenticity really makes a difference. And what happens is they get new information. And the more experiences which they get, the more likely it is that they get new and useful information. And from that, we see changes in attitudes and their sense of identity, who they think they are and who they think they might become. And so more is more. And often it's if you have a choice between doing a 2 or 3 or 4 week placement in one area or lots of small interventions where they might have lots of job fairs or career talks or interact with people, often it's the second one which is more effective. That's what research tells us. Because what that allows them to do is to broaden their understanding and test their assumptions. So if you're looking to develop employer engagement, if you're looking to deliver that, authenticity is really important. It needs to be authentic, it needs to look authentic, feel authentic. It's more important than them simply, sometimes they say, well, people will come into the school and they don't talk very well. But it's more important that they're authentic. If you talk too well, it's like you're trying to sell something. Commonplace, volume really matters, more is more. If the young people say it's useful, then you're in the right place. Varied, different activities are linked to different outcomes, contextualized. There's good studies, which show that if we have these sorts of interventions in the context of strong career guidance within a school, the benefits for young people are greater. Interesting. Personalized, because, we're all individuals, and that's so important. And I think sometimes it gets forgotten. Particularly if you look at the labour market information and you use labour market information alone and you only base it on averages, there is like an economist's view that everybody should just aspire to do the jobs which pay the most. Well, we're all individuals. Some of us, we probably want to get the most within the job which allows me to be with my family, to work outside, to work with my hands, to pursue my passion. And again, as with general career guidance, begun young. I'm finishing up now. I will suggest one other paper which you might be interested in, which is about how we can make use of the data which we have in order to be able to test whether we feel young people have had enough. And from the data which we looked at, this is from the UK, but if you look at some of the data from the longitudinal databases, we find that there are some clear relationships between the attitudes which young people express, the experiences which they have, and whether they do better or worse than we would expect once again to the labour market. And I think that's useful because it allows us to not worry about who's doing what in terms of qualifications, but allows us to treat all young people as individuals and compare them to other individuals who are like them and say, are you doing better or worse than we would expect? And I think that way we can look to try and increase the ability of what we do collectively to allow those young people to reach their potential. So I'm going to stop there, except to say, it's not just us who believe this. You've got copies of this document. It's the European Union, European Commission, UNESCO, the International Labour Organization, CEDEFOP. We together put out this document. It's only the second one we've all been able to agree on. The first one was about work-based learning is a good thing. That's kind of what it was called, really. This one is that career guidance is a good thing. And for countries, it's still early to be able to say to them very precisely exactly how much you should do and what you should do. And this is what we want to do over the next few years through all the comparative data we've got, and we can compare different countries and sort of outcomes we're seeing. But what we would say to, I think, nearly all countries, which is that whatever you're doing in the past, do more in the future. Young people want it, and we can use it strategically. Not just around career guidance, but we could use it strategically to enrich education, to enrich the student experience, to underpin student attainment. So that's me. Do feel free to contact me if that's useful. I have no idea how long I've spoken for, or if everybody, but if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to take questions as well.
Suur tänu.
Thank you very much. And questions, this address that I gave you, when we have group work and you weren't able to access the questions environment, but it is open, you can put your question there, and the questions will follow before lunch, and then we will have the opportunity to discuss everything. At the moment, we won't have a quick questions round. But our next presenter, we have 12 tables here and approximately 10 people around the tables, and each table has a head. So please stand up so that you can see who is in charge of the table. You will organize the discussions. We will have important and interesting questions. And the first one, why are why is career guidance and the competencies of young people so important? You can think about answers, and the heads of the table know the address of the environment. So the discussion will start now. Why are career competencies so important today?